Thank you so much for joining us this morning. I know it's the last day and it's 8:30. Really appreciate it. My name is Romy Beard. I'm the Head of Publisher Relations at Kronos Hub. Pleased to have this session together with three great speakers. We've got Ralph Youngen from the American Chemical Society, Tim from Liblinks, and Keith Webster from Carnegie Mellon. So I'm just going to do a very short introduction, and then we'll have 5 minutes presentations from each of our speakers, followed by a discussion, and then we'll have some Q&A at the end as well. So what this session is about is combining the read and publish user journey. There's a lot of read and publish agreements. I think in the US you use the term transformative agreements a little bit more, where libraries negotiate with publishers to have one agreement that covers reading and publishing. But the user journey is still very separate. The author goes to one place to read and a different place to publish. So what we want to explore in this session, what things could look like if an author would log in at one place for both of those things, for both reading content and publishing in journals, and what problems that might solve. So I'll hand over first to Ralph, who will talk a little bit about access management.
Thanks, Romy. So my job is to set the stage here a little bit. Whoops, let's go forward rather than backwards. Since we're talking about user experience, user journeys, I wanted to go back in time a little bit and remind us all about how we got to the point where we are. So back at the dawn of the web in the early 90s, if you needed to log into a website, you were going to do that with a username and password that was very specific for that single-use purpose, right? If you had a Yahoo account, or I have here the ACS membership, we had a way that members could log in. It was only for one use that you would have those usernames and passwords. Things got a little bit better in the mid-2000s when Google started to allow you to log into all of their properties with a single username and password for your Google services. Of course, that grew broadly then. Getting some feedback here on the mic. I don't know if there's something you can do about that.
Do you have a phone in your pocket?
I do. Was that the problem? Maybe. Now we know that we can log in with these social accounts, very prevalently through different web properties. But on the scholarly side, we started to also be able to log into things using your university credentials. I show here the ability to log in to our site with university credentials. This is called federated authentication. You probably also know it as Shibboleth or Open Athens. And during the pandemic, we at ACS saw an explosion of federated authentication use on our site. You can see the trend here that I'm showing. On average, we have about 64 times the amount of federated authentications happening at our site. And this, I should be clear, this is on our read site. This is on the site that people come to read our content. So there's been quite an explosion of use there. But if we look at the entire user journey, researcher journey, starting with authoring content through peer review, most of those are still single purpose, right? If you're using a collaboration tool to author content, you probably have a single purpose identity used for that. If you're logging into a peer review system, you're probably using a username and password specific to that peer review system. In terms of reading, typically it's IP addresses that authorize your use, although we're starting to see some federated authentication, as I just mentioned. Post-publication, if you are commenting on something, you're probably logging in with a single-purpose account there. And then research and discovery tools are largely single-purpose, although we are starting to see some federated authentication happening there as well. I think a claim could really be made that the user journey would be much smoother if we just had federated authentication around this entire researcher lifecycle here. And we're starting to see a little bit of that, and Tim's going to talk about that a little bit more. So whenever I say that, I often hear, especially from the library community, yes, but what about patron privacy? Especially in the read portion of that researcher lifecycle. IP addresses have kept patrons, have preserved patrons' privacy for several decades. Yes, that's true, but times are changing. Apple now, with their iCloud Private Relay, has a service on their devices that basically hides your IP address. If you're using their private relay and coming to my site, even if you're sitting on a university campus, I can't detect that your IP address is associated with that university. And so you would be treated as though you were not authorized to access content. So we've got to evolve with the times. I think this privacy concern is going to be resolved by something that you probably haven't heard of yet that I'll introduce here, called decentralized identities. This idea here is that you own your own identity. You don't have to rely on your university, you don't have to rely on Google, you don't have to rely on anyone else to give you a username and password to use. You have a digital wallet that is yours, and you can put what are called verifiable claims into this digital wallet. So if I can make that a little more clear, in the physical world, the state of Virginia issued me a driver's license. If I go into a liquor store, I hand over my driver's license to prove that I'm authorized to buy liquor. Now, when I do that, I give them a lot more information than they really need. They've got my name, they've got my address, they've got my unique identifier, they've got my height, they've got, lots of stuff that they don't need. All they really need to know is, yes, I am of legal age to buy liquor. Well, in the state of Maryland, if you have an iPhone, if you look in your Apple Wallet on your iPhone, there is a place here where you can go and add your digital driver's license into your iPhone if you're from a few states. So you can see this is starting to happen here. And in that case, if I were to walk into a liquor store, all I would have to do is assert that I am of legal age to buy the liquor. I don't have to convey a lot of additional private information. In our world, that claim could be, I am a faculty member at Ohio State University. That's all you need to know about me, is I am a faculty member, and Ohio State would back up that claim, and publishers would be able to verify that claim. This is a world that I think we're moving into. It's not here yet. It won't be here for a few years, but I think it's coming. So with that, I'll turn it over to Tim.
Hey everyone, hi. So I'm going to follow on from what Ralph said and talk a bit more practically about how this plays out currently. So there's three things I'm going to cover: the challenge with the current access experience, why is it so complex? The benefits of a unified access experience, and then in some of my remarks later, I'll talk a bit more about an identity strategy, what it is, and how it could really transform this read and publish experience. So let's go into this. So here's a very simplistic diagram just showing an example of why, in this case, Emerald Publishing were looking to unify their access experience. So you have a whole series of different people coming into different systems. And this is both to explain the complexity of the current system and also to explain the fact that the issue of identities is quite complex. So we can have someone coming into a subscription database through an institutional IP address. They could also be coming in using federated authentication, where they're logging in using their institutional credentials. They may be making some ebook purchases personally with a username and password they registered. They may be submitting some articles with an institutional username and password. They might also be a member of a society, and they get some credential training through that society, but then they have to use their society credentials. Although it would be extreme, in fact, all of these identities could be the same person. But as far as these systems are concerned, they're all individual people because these are all siloed. So you've got sort of two levels of complexity happening here. You've got the complexity that each different authentication method is collecting different types of credentials and feeding into a different system, and the fact that all these different identities are treated as different as well, and they could actually be the same person. So this was the experience that Emerald was having before they transitioned, and this is the experience afterwards. So in this case, they were using liblinks to do identity and access, so we sat in front of all these databases. Whatever use case the person has, whether they're a faculty member, a student, a librarian, it doesn't really matter. They log in through one access experience, and then from there are fed through to the various databases. It also means you have a single experience for access, so in terms of training people to use interfaces, it's significantly easier. It also means you can then start bolting on benefits like seamless access. So if you're not familiar with seamless access, it's a way to remember your institutional affiliation, which means that once you've accessed the system once and said you're from the College of Charleston, the next time you try to access the system, it will flag, do you want to access through the College of Charleston? So these methods of removing friction and simplifying access are pretty critical to allowing us to compete against all the other ways that people can get information and helping readers and authors get to the systems they need as fast as possible. And in this case, you can see that the Kronos Hub branding is on the editorial workflow system. So it's all covered. The read and publish journey is the same wherever you're going in. And that's me done, and I'll be coming back later. I'll say with Keith.
Okay, good morning, everyone. I'm Keith Webster. I'm Dean of Libraries at Carnegie Mellon. We are a very high research university based in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Just by way of context around transformative agreements, within the next week or so, we'll have all but one of our major publishers engaged with us in a transformative agreement of some sort. And I would estimate in 2023, about 80% of our article output will be covered by a transformative agreement. And if there's anybody here from the big society that would like to close the gap in the top 10 publishers, I'm happy to chat afterwards. So my perspective is maybe a little bit less excited than my colleagues in terms of the issues that our researchers are wrestling with in these transformative agreements and the issues that the library team are struggling with. There is a question in my mind about whether our research community considers read and publishing in the same workflow, or are they such discrete activities happening in a theoretical model of a research project months or years apart? And I'm particularly intrigued by the question of whether or not they view those as being associated with individual publishers or activities that they view as part of their university experience. I'm reminded, and this is a slightly quirky example, but there are 3 Brits on the panel. Foyle's bookstore in London, at least once upon a time, was the biggest bookstore in the world, and they used to organize fiction by publisher rather than an A to Z or A to Z author model, which was a pain. If you went in to browse for books, you had to go to the Penguin collection, then to the Macmillan, and so on. And I wonder about the extent to which researchers really want to do that when they are interacting with journal content. And I previously worked in one of the big commercial publishers, and I absolutely understand the business argument for sucking end users into the platform and keeping them there, because it drives up usage of the content, it drives up journal brand recognition and loyalty. But from an institutional perspective, I don't feel that that is adding a desperate amount of value to our researchers. Another question I have is, and I think Ralph's circular image really showed it very nicely, for a researcher who is interacting with a particular journal brand or even with a publisher's platform, the range of interactions they have can be quite extensive. It could be searching for content, reading articles, they might act as a peer reviewer, they might be a journal editor, they might submit content, they might wish to track impact. And that is a huge amount of activities that could be replicated for a researcher across half a dozen or more publishers. And to what extent do they want to remember, okay, you can have password managers, but remembering their credentials across these and the different ways of working across publisher platforms. Those are more generic points that I would just offer about the extent to which our researchers want to do this on a publisher's platform. On the transformative agreement side, we're seeing, as we roll more and more of those out, a number of questions emerging. Our website at the moment points researchers to our agreements by publisher. And increasingly, as more of our content is covered by a specific agreement, the question turns to, can I look at the journals you have under transformative or other open access type agreements by journal title rather than by publisher, because I don't necessarily work in that way. The other thing that we've noticed, and I'll say more about this in a moment under the librarian's perspective, is that most of our agreements have very distinctive, quirky business terms. For example, when an agreement comes into being, some publishers allow that to cover articles that are submitted for review after the agreement has gone live. Other publishers apply the agreement to articles that are accepted for publication after the agreement has gone live. We struggle to remember how we get all of that into our authors' minds is even more challenging. We have some agreements that only cover hybrid titles, traditional subscription titles in the publisher's portfolio, but excludes gold titles. Again, that's a nuance that for many researchers is just something they don't want to waste brain power on. And it's even more confusing if a publisher flips a title from hybrid to gold in the middle of the year, and how you keep track of that is another thing. What about the excluded titles? Some publishers say the agreement will cover everything apart from these particular, typically high-value titles. And if your agreement has an annual article cap, how does the researcher know whether their article is going to be before the cap is exhausted or afterwards, and what are the implications for them should their article be accepted for publication? So that's all a suite of questions that our researchers are beginning to wrestle with. One thing that we have been doing as a library on a completely different theme is really focusing on an end-to-end workflow from the grant writing stage to the impact assessment, and very strongly building connectors between things like our protocol service and our electronic lab notebooks, between laboratory instrumentation and our data repository. And people certainly are really viewing their information aspects of research as being as smooth and connected a workflow as possible. So the question that we would pose institutionally is, can we achieve all of these activities in terms of reading and publishing for a researcher focused on our single sign-on rather than by individual publisher credentials? Those of you working in the US university research landscape or the US publishing landscape will be aware of the recent memo from the OSTP. Tucked away inside that is a point about some sort of digital persistent identifier for researchers, and there may be something that flows from whatever addresses that question that might solve some of these challenges. But for researchers at the moment, they've got a bunch of identifiers that we use in our campus research information system, things like their ORCID, which I gather people in the OSTP think is a flower. That was one of my great takeaways from this week. We have a Scopus identifier, a Web of Science identifier. Can all of that somehow be bundled together into something that maybe addresses these questions? And then just finally a few grumbles from the library perspective about the administration of transformative agreements. And let me preface this by saying that I absolutely am of the view that transformative agreements stand as one of the best ways that we can think about how we arrive at a new equilibrium in the scholarly publishing business. I'm not a huge champion of green open access because I think that the ability of our authors to reserve their rights is the paramount way of making a sustainable and enduring change in the publishing business. Transformative agreements are a very elegant way of helping our community do that. So I've made the point about standardizing business terms. Can we help publishers work towards a common approach to transformative agreements and help us share those with researchers in a straightforward and meaningful way? Author verification and approval dashboards seem to be the bane of my colleagues' lives. They seem to spend an increasing amount of time verifying articles. I understand why, but and we know that there are solutions like Cronus Hub that can help us take the pain out of that process, but it is something we are very concerned about. Author tourism is something that some of our publisher partners are increasingly flagging with us, that there seems to be a sudden spike in the number of corresponding authors on certain projects where the Carnegie Mellon corresponding author was a bit of a surprise, somewhat unexpected given what appeared to be a fairly modest role in the research project. And they're simply speculating whether the authors have figured out which of their number has access to an institutional agreement. And that's something that we know we need to keep on top of as a community. And thinking about how, against that backdrop, we can give publishers assurances that the corresponding author is indeed affiliated with us. And that's just one other sticking point that I would flag, where early career researchers have done work with us, but as is the way of early career researchers, they've moved to a different institution, maybe to take up an assistant professorship. They wish to publish the article with their new institution clearly branded on the article, but the research was done with us and they would like to have the article published under our agreement. There's a lot of reverse engineering with publishers to accommodate that. And I think we've all made the points about authentication and authorization, so I think it's probably time for questions. Over to you, Romy.
Thank you so much. Yeah, there are some really interesting points there, Keith, that you brought up and that we've talked about in our prep call. And one thing that I want to unpack is this idea that, Tim talked about having one login for one publisher where you can then read and publish journals. And I think the benefit of that is that you don't have that confusion between, is this journal, can I read it, can I publish in it? But you would see that on the journal level for both of those. But what you then talked about is taking it one step further and say, what if users would authenticate through the library system and from there go on to publish? And then you don't have the problem of approval dashboards, because as a publisher, you already know where the user is coming from. And you can do away with things like author tourism. So you always know this is where this author comes from. There's no, today it's the other author that can claim the article. So I think that's a really interesting point. And I'd like to hear, maybe Ralph wants to say something about that and whether that would solve issues for publishers as well, if the access was managed that way.
Yeah, that is the idea that we're kind of slowly, the industry is slowly moving toward. That is how federated authentication can work with something like Tim talked about, overlaying with seamless access, which has that more persistence where I can kind of travel from one site to the other and be able to remember the institution that I come from. That kind of world is slowly emerging, where what you said, Romy, is exactly right. You could authenticate through your library system on your campus, and then as you go out into the other reaches of the researcher ecosystem, it would kind of follow you around and simplify the authentication process no matter where you are.
And what would it take for this to become a reality, Tim? Do you want to talk about that? What do publishers need to do, or what do libraries need to do in terms of strategy?
Yeah, so we've had some interesting experience here with one of the publishers who work with Emerald, who last year designated the year as the year of the author, and took a really different direction to a lot of traditional publishers, where they focused on the researcher life cycle in particular. And as part of that work, they decided to develop an identity strategy. And it's been really fascinating seeing how that's changed the way they've thought about how they operate as a publisher and within a library ecosystem. So I just wanted to talk a bit about what their experience was. So what I mean by an identity strategy is that it's a publisher business strategy that leverages user identity to build a mutually valuable relationship with your community based on an understanding of user needs and motivations and respect for their decisions about how they do or do not want their personal information used. This sounds a bit obvious. What else would you do? But traditionally, a lot of publishers have collected credentials from users with the user expectation that there'd be something interesting done with them, there'd be some value in return, and actually, they often get disappointed because The credentials just get collected and used for marketing, but from the user's perspective, well, what did I get out of that? Not all identity strategies look alike. There's no set formula because publishers serve a multitude of content needs across diverse markets. So we've got academic, public, special libraries, governments, corporations. Emerald's motivation was initially driven by the need to ensure effective access controls and to meet the changing needs of traditional customers, such as using federated authentication to simplify remote access. So that first slide I showed you, where you have all these different ways that people are trying to access systems and the systems are all siloed, that's where they started from. Let's just try and improve some efficiencies within our systems. And as they began to plan, they spotted a much bigger opportunity to better engage users across the board by understanding and improving their individual informational needs. So in particular, to meet user expectations for personalization through the research lifecycle. An important part of this was considering the long-term value they could offer users beyond just recommendations based on their historical activity. Which, when you think about personalization, that's really where people generally think about it. Okay, so I've searched some articles, great, you're going to recommend some other articles. A key part of this vision was developing individual profiles that could enable tailored experiences. And doing this required Emerald to collect more information from users about their interests. And there was explicit recognition that this required that users be offered something equally valuable in return. And the phrase that they used was leveling up the value exchange. And again, this shouldn't be radical, but honestly, it really is. There are relatively few publishers, I think, who design systems around personalization and collecting credentials who explicitly up front say, let's just make sure that what we're giving back in return is worth collecting these credentials. Another important consideration for Emerald was building trust. So given the often bewildering array of choices that users face, Emerald saw people gravitating towards brands they trusted. Emerald wanted to develop an identity strategy to build trust in the Emerald experience and brand. And there's an unavoidable tension in there between these user-centric models focusing on building direct relationships with users and the traditional curation and custodian roles of academic libraries. And I know when I've worked as a publisher previously, there's always a bit of concern that if you go to talk directly to users, you're bypassing the library, and how's the library being disintermediated there? So Emerald felt very strongly they wanted to develop a mutually beneficial identity strategy where building direct relationships with users would help them to generate more value to libraries for them as services. Another really fascinating insight for Emerald was the idea of transforming from a content platform business into an experience platform and shifting the strategic focus to information needs and practices and away from containers of text for sale. So one of the examples they were using internally when they were communicating with staff about how this could change their business was Spotify. So Spotify is an experience platform. You do more than just listen to music. You're also engaging with the platform to organize the songs you like and discover new music based on those experiences and maybe build communities of interest around those. So they wanted to earn trust and deliver value to users through those platform experiences rather than just here's some content. So what were the benefits that Emerald was looking for from this? So one was simplifying access to content and services that we talked about, with seamless access being an important component of that. Another one was more flexible support for new business models and reducing reliance on the big deal. And as you saw again from my slide earlier, there are many ways in which people engage with content. It can be subscriptions, it can be purchasing it individually, it can be through different organizations they're affiliated with. And that makes it a really complex experience. And Emerald wanted to try and come up with a unified approach where the user had to worry far less about the platform or system they were engaging with, and it just felt like they were just moving from one experience to another that was all part of the researcher experience, the researcher lifecycle for them. They also realized that they needed to work differently internally, and this was a cultural challenge for them. So, and you may see similar things in academic institutions as well. So there are more internal interactions needed across teams so that, for example, product and marketing staff could co-create a more engaging and immersive on-site experience. Less large-scale implementations that were very expensive and risky, more small-scale experiments. A lot of the time, they were really borrowing some of the analogies from software development, where instead of just having a large project that takes 6 months, do these small iterative developments. And so they actually broke up some departments and created smaller teams that would borrow people from departments on a project for a period, and then would be able to take that knowledge back into the department with them. Perhaps unsurprisingly, Emerald found that the hardest task is shifting the organizational mindset to data-driven and user-first decisions and away from traditional models of scholarly value. Finally, Emerald recognized the real costs of doing nothing. I think another challenge we face in our industry is managing risk and wanting to do things that are innovative and being held back by the fact that this may pay out over a longer period. This work involves significant costs and risks, but the leadership understood that the bigger risk lay in not doing anything, and so losing their competitive edge and existing users. So it's really interesting how much this sort of thinking, a user-centric, research-focused approach, has some pretty fundamental implications for how we structure ourselves as organizations and how we think about our relationship with users.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and if I could follow up something, a term Tim mentioned several times in there was trust. And trust is really a cornerstone here. As I've been interacting with the library community very directly for the last many years, I've come to see that trust is a huge problem. Let's just face it, a problem in the industry. So, like on the read side, when reading is purely based on IP addresses, okay, fine, that's pretty easy, right? But when that changes to federated authentication, suddenly the library, the academic library, is in the position of having to trust your central IT to get the parameters right for that federated authentication out to the publishing ecosystem. And the library has to trust the publishers that they're not going to do something nefarious and use these credentials to track users inappropriately. And so that trust is really the cornerstone. Romy, you asked, what does it take to really, make this go further and faster? That's what it has been. I really think it's that trust that has been a rate limiting factor. We're really starting to address that. I think we're really starting to overcome that now. If you haven't already seen it, if you go to the seamlessaccess.org website, we recently released a model language agreement that has some draft contract language that can cover the use of federated authentication with your relationships with publishers. And so I would encourage you, to go out there and look at that. And we did this, as another aspect of building that trust to say, here's some legal language, that you can use to ensure that your patrons are getting the right level of protection that you are expecting in the agreement with your publishers.
Do we then need to do more to perhaps establish more trust between the author and the publisher, the author and the library? Because some of the kind of issues with approval dashboard is, that as a library, as you said, Keith, those were your words, I think, you want to give the publisher the confidence that this author is really from my institution. That's what it's about. But do you have issues then where, you don't trust the author, you want to assess whether they are part of your institution?
In many ways, if I tie all of that together, for us, the moment when it all became easy was when our single sign-on system also included our payroll system, because at that point we knew the university would want to get it right, and we knew that our researchers would want to get it right, and that made our reliance upon the data feed of identities much more credible. From my perspective, what I want our researchers to be able to do is, as easily as possible, have their articles published under the agreements that we've negotiated without redundant checks. And in this transitional period, I appreciate that publishers want to be sure that somebody who submits an article saying, I'm from Carnegie Mellon, I don't need to pay to have this open access. They want to know that that is indeed the case. And that's why I think tying it into our single sign-on system would make things much easier for everyone, because we can pretty much guarantee that somebody who is able to access the publishing platform using a CMU SSO is indeed part of our community, and that should be the end of the matter. Mm-hmm. And from the library doesn't want or need to be part of that process. We're happy to do it so that the agreements are up and running, but it should be a straightforward author to publisher interaction.
That is actually something you can do on the Kronos Hub platform for institutions, that you tie into the single sign-on with the institution, and from there on, authors submit to publishers. I think then there's still some issue with trust. Would publishers recognize that it's gone through your SSO, and do they know about that? So I think there's a lot of education to do around that, to see, is that a way around approval dashboards?
And there's still that messiness of, okay, I know that CMU has an agreement with Elsevier, since that was our first one, but can I be sure that my article isn't going to be caught out by some obscure rule, like this particular journal is excluded, or there's an annual cap that was just exhausted by my colleague next door. And that's the sort of automatic feedback that I'm hoping we can figure out how to give to our researchers up front.
Tim, you wanted to say something else? Anyone who's got any questions, please make your way to the microphone.
Just in case it isn't clear to people, one of the huge advantages to institutions of federated authentication is that you control it. I know as someone who manages access control, one of the challenges with IP authentication is there's very limited information that gets transferred with it. So we don't know if a user really still is working at your institution or not. We don't know whether they're faculty. We don't know whether they're alumni. We don't know whether they're meant to have access to this database or not. It's really a very simplistic approach. Federated authentication, your institutions determine what attributes are sent. And so, in Keith's example, one aspect of building trust across our community is trusting the signals that are sent. And federated authentication allows you to control what's sent. You to determine when any information is released, if it's personal or not. And you also get to control who gets to access systems. I mean, at the end of the day, the publisher has to trust what they're sent and work with it. So I think trust gets tied into control as well, and I think giving institutions more control will help build that trust. It's a fundamentally different approach to things.
Do we have any questions from the audience? Do you want to come up to the microphone, please? Thank you.
Hi, Rob Carlon, Columbia. Thanks for your presentation. Just a comment, question. There's one of the trust relationship here, and that's between the faculty and the campus researchers and graduate students and the libraries and these organizations as well. So there's a trust relationship that's very important there, and that one has to be very carefully managed through these transitions. Thanks.
Any other questions or comments from the audience? Tim, yeah?
That's a great point. Another important point of trust is between libraries and their campus IT. That is a critical one because libraries often don't have the resources to, either financial resources or the skills and experience to manage these technologies in-house. And if your campus IT is not working closely with you or does not understand what on earth the library does, it becomes incredibly challenging to then enable these resources to meet library needs. And surveys have been done by Seamless Access on this area, and there is not good communication at all. There's not good understanding of each other's roles. That's a really critical area. The technology per se is rarely the actual issue. It's all the cultural issues around that and silos, and that's a key one.
Yeah, in the session yesterday, there was one librarian who said they have someone in the faculty who's with the partner is in the IT, so they have a really good relationship. And so it's hard to replicate. Any other comments from our panel before we close? Because I think we're coming up to the end of our allocated time slot.
Can I make one quick plea? My contact lens fell out while we were talking. If anyone's got any contact lens solution, yeah, it's there. I'd love it.
Well, join me in thanking our panel. Thanks for joining me today and for making it here in the morning. Thank you so much, everyone.